but it does say that it would be imprudent and irresponsible to not have any plans for it. Steve.
NTD's Iris Tao reporting from the White House. Iris, thank you. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken today addressing the United Nations Security Council. The speech coming amid international fears that multiple countries could be dragged into a Mideast war, possibly involving the United States and Iran.
The United States does not seek conflict with Iran. We do not want this war to widen. But if Iran or its proxies attack U.S. personnel anywhere, make no mistake, we will defend our people. We will defend our security swiftly and decisively.
Just this week, Iranian-backed groups attacked American bases in the Middle East, and the U.S. is taking new steps to protect its troops, sending warships and fighter aircraft into that region. Blinken saying UN Security Council members have a responsibility to prevent the conflict from spreading. Meanwhile, later this week, Blinken is set to meet with China's top diplomat Wang Yi in Washington. Beijing has refused to explicitly condemn Hamas, and the White House says the administration will bring up the challenges it has with Beijing in the coming meetings. Israel's military today saying it's ready to enter the next stage of the war. It's just waiting for instructions. Many expected a ground invasion of Gaza to happen much sooner. Meanwhile, the U.S. is telling Israel to delay the invasion until all hostages are released. To learn more about these complex issues, we have William Ruger, president of the American Institute for Economic Research, who is also an officer in the United States Navy Reserves. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, William, with regard to the U.S. suggesting to Israel to delay the ground invasion, do you agree with this approach, and what might be the reasons they're suggesting to do so?
Well, Israel needs to secure itself given its strategic context, especially after those horrific attacks. And so really the discussion about what Israel should do is properly for Israelis. That being said, the United States is obviously an important stakeholder in the Middle East and has its own interests to bear. And so you can understand why the United States would want to have an impact on how Israel is deciding what to do next, particularly given the fact that the United States has an interest in preventing this from becoming a wider war that the United States could be drawn into.
Exactly. To your point, reports are that Israeli military officials not happy with this approach and would like to press forward. And they're actually upset with Prime Minister Netanyahu for continuing to hold off. Does this complicate things for Israel, and how much so?
Well, look, Israeli politics is always going to be complicated by the relationship with the United States. The United States is such an important partner of Israel, and therefore it has to consider American voices on this. That being said, at a certain point, the ability of the United States to determine Israeli policy is going to be somewhat limited. And again, this is not surprising, right? The United States has a set of national interests. Israel has a set of national interests. A lot of times those things are overlapping, but not always. And so you can see tensions in the relationship developing. That being said, the relationship is still quite strong.
As you mentioned, Israel and the United States have their own set of interests. I would say President Biden's focus right now is the U.S. hostages that are still in possession of Hamas. Given the current state of play, how likely is it that a comprehensive hostage release deal can be reached between Israel and Hamas and the U.S.?
Yeah, again, that's very difficult to say. Obviously, Hamas taking these hostages thought that it had an advantage in doing so, despite the fact that this would, really be have a negative impact on the international outlook towards Hamas, and rightly so. So I don't think that they're going to give them back without something serious in return. And the question is will the United States, will Israel really want to give that?
More money?
Again, I think it's just terrible that you see hostages being taken. Innocent non-combatant civilians should not be targets of political activity in this way. But you see it being something that Hamas believes will secure its interests. But one thing that's important to understand is that research on the use or targeting of innocent non-combatants shows that it's actually strategically imprudent, right? So it's not only is it morally foolish, but it doesn't generally work. Terrorism that targets specifically innocent non-combatants is a failure, generally speaking. And so it's actually quite unwise. And so I hope that Hamas will return these hostages and stop targeting innocent non-combatants.
Thank you for having me. That's great to see you again.
Of course, Mary, great to see you. Mary, you've experienced the brutality of the Iranian regime firsthand, from the inside. There's a lot of discussion about Iran in the shadows of this Israel-Hamas conflict. What do you think? How are you assessing this situation right now?
Actually, it's not just a shadow. In many countries, especially in the Middle East, there are a lot of terrorist groups that we call them the proxy groups of the Islamic Republic regime. I can say they are the arms or the hands of the regime out of the borders of Iran, and they are enable the regime to advance terrorist actions and riotous foreign policies in other countries. And it appears that the regime is not directly involved, and it's an attempt to try not to face other countries directly and not to face international laws and international organizations. And it lets the regime stay in a margin of safety. But I can say some terrorist groups like Hamas, they cannot continue existing without the regime, because the regime, it's been many years, not just in the recent conflict, the regime is arming them, funding them, and training them for many years. You can see many obvious signs. For example, in the videos that we could see from the attack of Hamas in Israel, we could hear easily that someone was saying "call" in Persian with Persian accent. It means that Iranians were involved in that attack in the hospital. Unfortunately, many civilian people were killed in Gaza. They claim that Israel attacked the hospital, but we can remember about the shooting Ukrainian passenger plane, that it happened by IRGC. Actually, this is a policy that they try to kill civilian people. They publish the pictures of the children who were killed to attract pity of the people from other countries. They don't want to have political negotiation. They just want to attract your pity.
So, Mary, let me just ask you, what do you think is Iran's end game in all of this? What are they ultimately hoping for, do you think?
Actually, because this is a strategy. It's not just a tactic. It's not temporary. This is a strategy that for many years the regime is following. And we can predict, we can guess that maybe we can consider a lot of reasons, but maybe the main reason is an attempt to destroy the peace agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia needs to react about what is going on, and Saudi Arabia must face Arab countries. So it's an important and maybe vital time for Saudi Arabia to take a side and show where Saudi Arabia is standing. But regardless of that, I want to ask that how the regime can advance this policy. As you remember, recently, America paid $6 billion to the regime. But we knew that if you pay money to the regime, you would see more terrorist actions even in other countries, overseas. If you fight against Hamas today, if you fought against ISIS yesterday, tomorrow another terrorist group would be created by the regime. We don't want you to attack Iran. We want you to be inside of the people of Iran who are fighting against the regime.
Yeah, Mary, that $6 billion that was released back to Iran in the hostage, or prisoner swap, I guess you would call it, has definitely come under a lot of scrutiny here in the United States. I want to ask you, before we let you go, if you could just kind of paint the picture for us inside of Iran, the situation there. Most totalitarian regimes, they have a lot of bluster. They rule by the iron fist. But there's also a lot of vulnerability. We see that in China as well. Is the Iranian regime vulnerable?
Definitely it is. And I want to say that the main reason that proves that the regime is vulnerable is that the people of Iran are not behind the regime. The Iranian opposition tried to make the regime isolated for many years, and as other countries not to negotiate, not to have any kind of relationship with the regime, and it would be a big step and help us to make a revolution in Iran. Now the regime is alone in Iran and outside of Iran. So I believe that the regime is so much vulnerable.
Mary Mohammadi, thank you so much for taking some time to join us.
Thank you for having me.
And that is all we have for you this evening on the Capitol.
Security grounds. The Court of Appeal heard today that that decision was unlawful. 8 years ago, Begum travelled from Bethnal Green in East London with two of her school friends to join the ISIS terror group. She made headlines again in 2019 as an ISIS bride, saying she wanted to return to the UK to give birth to her son. Her comments to the media sparked controversy as she appeared to show little remorse over the ideology of ISIS. Earlier this year, the 24-year-old lost a challenge against a decision at the Special Immigration Appeals Commission. In the ruling, Mr. Justice Jay said the case had been of great concern and difficulty. The hearing at the Court of Appeal is expected to last for 3 days.
Presidential election, I believed that challenging the results on behalf of President Trump should be pursued in a just and legal way. I endeavored to represent my client to the best of my ability.
Ellis elaborated that she relied on information from other lawyers but didn't double-check everything that they said. The terms of her plea agreement include 5 years probation, 100 hours of community service, a $5,000 fine, and cooperating with prosecutors. Chief Financial Officer Alan Weisselberg with increasing the total assets. He said this was based on a number the former president arbitrarily elected and that the number was whatever number Mr. Trump told them to do. Before entering the courtroom, Cohen told reporters this is about accountability, plain and simple. Trump saying Cohen was a proven liar and accused him of trying to get a better deal for himself. A former lawyer for former strip away those two very things. Now, in a previous episode, we already went through point by point how a judge here in the state of New York ordered the dissolution of President Trump's real estate empire by stripping him of the necessary licenses that he needs to operate those particular businesses. Now, President Trump is currently in the process of appealing that decision, and if you want to dive deeper into it, well, I'll throw a link to the episode where we explain this case in much greater depth right there in the top right corner. However, right now, the courts are working to strip away the second element that Trump possesses, his large platform. Because you see, just yesterday, President Trump was over in the state of Iowa giving a campaign rally speech wherein, this is part of what he said, quote, "They have weaponized the Justice Department. This is like a banana republic. But it's going to be okay. The good news is I'm the only one that's ever been indicted where the poll numbers went through the roof because the people understand it." He then went on in his speech to explain exactly why he decided to challenge the 2020 election results. For anyone who's been at a Trump rally or seen his speeches over the past year, this was pretty standard fare. However, something unusual happened yesterday. Shortly after giving the speech over in the state of Iowa, President Trump was hit with a gag order. Specifically, this was a gag order requested by Special Counsel Jack Smith. He is the federal prosecutor pushing forward the January 6th election case over in Washington, D.C. And in this request, in this gag order request, Jack Smith asked the court to, quote, "limit what President Trump can say about the prosecutors, potential witnesses, and about the case itself," arguing that with his wide reach online, he could influence jurors in his favor. However, there was something else inside of this request here, which gave us, meaning the public at large, a bit of a peek behind the curtain. That's because, besides just the witnesses, the prosecutors, and the case itself, Jack Smith was also arguing that, quote, "President Trump should be prohibited from making disparaging remarks about Joe Biden." I repeat, the prosecutor in this case was not only trying to stop President Trump from speaking publicly about the case, but he was also trying to prevent President Trump from being able to say anything negative about Joe Biden, even though Joe Biden has nothing to do with the case. He's not a witness, nor is he a juror. And yet, for some reason, leading up to the 2024 election, Jack Smith made the attempt to place a gag order on President Trump,
stopping him from being able to lobby any criticism at Joe Biden. Makes you wonder what this is really all about. Regardless, though, the judge in the case, who for your reference is Judge Tanya Chutkan, she only accepted part of Jack Smith's request. Specifically, on Monday, which was of course just yesterday, she issued this gag order right here, prohibiting President Trump from, quote, making any public statements or directing others to make any public statements that target, for one, the special counsel prosecuting this case or his staff, secondly, the defense counsel or their staff, thirdly, any of this court's staff or other supporting personnel, or fourthly, any reasonably foreseeable witness or the substance of their testimony. Meaning that if anyone is involved in this case, such as the prosecutor, Mr. Jack Smith, or anyone they decide to call on as a witness, President Trump is no longer allowed to criticize them publicly. However, the judge did reject the request to stop President Trump from being able to criticize the federal government or the Biden administration more broadly. Here is specifically what she wrote in her order in this particular respect. Quote, this order shall not be construed to prohibit President Trump from making statements criticizing the government generally, including the current administration or the Department of Justice, statements asserting that the defendant is innocent of the charges against him, or that his prosecution is politically motivated. Meaning that while the judge did grant the gag order, she only granted it in part. She rejected Jack Smith's attempt to stop President Trump from being able to criticize the Biden administration leading up to the 2024 election. Now, on the one hand, you can see the rationale for a gag order like this. It's done to stop President Trump from influencing the jury pool, meaning that Jack Smith and his team are supposedly worried about the statement that Trump releases on a social media platform, Truth Social, regarding this particular case, because it could impact the jurors who are deciding the case. For instance, in a recent post over on Truth Social, President Trump referred to prosecutor Jack Smith as being quote-unquote deranged. And so Jack Smith made the argument that President Trump needs to have a gag order placed on him ASAP before the jury pool gets contaminated by reading too many posts from Truth Social. But the irony of that argument is that this trial is taking place over in the city of Washington, D.C., with a Washington, D.C. jury pool. And just for your reference, in the last presidential election, Washington, D.C. voted 92% for Joe Biden and only about 5% for Trump. Furthermore, there was a recent poll that was conducted by Emerson College Polling, and they found that among Washington, D.C. potential jurors, 60 to 68% of them said that they would find Trump guilty if they were on the jury, meaning that without seeing any evidence, the overwhelming majority of the jury pool already thinks that Trump is guilty. In that same pool, by the way, it found that only 6 to 9% of the potential jurors would provide a presumption of innocence before hearing the evidence. And so the irony here is that while Jack Smith and his team are making the argument that this gag order is a necessity in order to prevent the jury pool from getting tainted, well, the reality is that the people over in Washington, D.C. are not logging into Truth Social. They're not following President Trump on his personal social media platform or listening to his campaign speeches over in Iowa. But Jack Smith is likely correct that the jury pool is indeed tainted, although not in the way that he implies. Regardless, though, the judge in the case, she agreed with Jack Smith, and President Trump does in fact have a gag order placed on him regarding this particular case as of yesterday. And last night, once the news of this gag order was made public, which happened shortly after his speech over in Iowa, President Trump issued a statement over on Truth Social writing this in part, quote, terrible thing happened today, gag order. We'll appeal that gag order ruling, witch hunt. And so the appeal process will, the current three frontrunners, they have all, in some way, shape, or form, promised to gut the deep state, otherwise known as the administrative state. And as a campaign promise, that's all well and good. Many people across the country support it. However, let's just assume for a super quick moment that a Republican candidate does go on to win the general election and becomes the 47th president of the country. Then what? Simply winning the White House does not necessarily mean that there will be broad changes to administrative policies, especially when you have an entrenched bureaucracy numbering in the hundreds of thousands that has formed over the last 100 plus years. And this administrative state, it has a clear liberal slant. In fact, according to data from the Federal Elections Commission, quote, a stunning 95% of political donations from federal employees went to Democratic liberal candidates. 95%. And so, with the massive growth of the federal government over the past 100 plus years, this has resulted in what some people refer to as the fourth branch of government, the bureaucratic branch, which is now dominated by liberal ideology. And this branch is large. Here's in fact how it's described over in the pages of the National Affairs magazine. Quote, it is fitting that we refer to the administrative state as a state, for it has become a sovereign power unto itself an imperium, an imperio regulating virtually every dimension of our lives. Its nearly 450 agencies are manned by legions of bureaucrats, now numbering almost 2.7 million. And so, millions of liberal bureaucrats entrenched within the federal government, irrespective of who actually resides in the White House. And it's exactly this scenario which has led to the birth of something called the Project 2025 initiative. This is a very, very large-scale project that was launched by the Heritage Foundation, which, for reference, is a conservative policy think tank. And Project 2025, otherwise known as the Presidential Transition Project, it aims to gut the federal government of its current progressive bureaucrats and replace them with conservative bureaucrats. And this initiative, which, just for reference, is already well into full swing, it aims to do most of the heavy lifting prior to the actual election, such that if a Republican were to, in fact, get elected into the White House, they would have a database of conservative personnel to essentially deconstruct the administrative state starting on day one, as well as have in place a training program in order to recruit ever more people. And so, in order to get a better idea of how Project 2025 will work in practice, we took the opportunity to speak with Mr. Spencer Cradian, who is the Associate Director of the project over at the Heritage Foundation. And he broke down for us exactly what they're doing to dismantle the administrative state, as well as what people across America can do if they wish to get involved. And take a listen. Spencer,
it was a couple of votes in a couple of swing states. You had Zucker boxes, you had all sorts of fraudulent stuff going on in the election. And by the way, there's fraud in every election, but when you weaponize a pandemic, a virus, and you change the way in which you handle elections, you're going to take that fraud that you have in every election, you're going to multiply it 10x. And so that's what happened in the 2020 election, and it's very unfortunate, but that's what happened.
Well, and I know a lot of people are saying now, like, what's Trump going to do? I mean, maybe this is just what we've been watching. It keeps looking like they're going to get him, and they end up not getting him. But, I mean, it's looking pretty rough. Where do you think Trump's at with all this?
Look, I think Trump is not worried about this at all. I think he understands that these people have to protect their livelihoods. But at the end of the day, if your viewers believe that Stalin or Mao had any greater ability to suppress the truth and incarcerate their political opponents than the Biden regime does, and they just haven't been paying attention. We just had a man sentenced to 22 years in federal prison for January 6th, and he wasn't even in Washington, D.C. We had a man recently sentenced to 17 years in federal prison on January 6th for shaking a fence. That's what's happening in America.
Well, that's all for tonight. Thank you for joining us, and as always, stay informed and stay free.
Do you feel the bills getting higher and higher every time you check out at the supermarket? Do you feel your monthly discretionary money has decreased, although your income increases yearly? Inflation is eating away at your wealth.